My name is Lisa Collins. I'm 34 years old, and I'm no longer sure I know who I am. It started with the accident on a rainy October evening in Oregon, while I was driving home from a business trip to Portland. I work as a graphic designer at a small advertising agency in Bend, and the trip was supposed to be routine, nothing that could change my life forever. I remember turning on the radio to stay awake, the rain drumming on the windshield of my Honda Civic, and then the bright headlights of an oncoming car swerving into my lane. Then nothing. I woke up in Cedar Ridge Hospital with Tom, my husband, sitting next to the bed, his usually neat dark hair disheveled and his eyes red from lack of sleep. Dr. Michael Stone explained that I had suffered a moderate traumatic brain injury. Nothing critical, but he wanted to observe me for a few more days, and warned about possible temporary memory problems, which was normal after such trauma, and usually recovered within a few weeks. He was right about the memory problems, but not in the way he thought. The first few days in the hospital passed quietly with Tom coming every day after work, and we talked about ordinary things like work, weekend plans, and how our cat Oscar was missing me at home. But on the fourth day, something changed. I was lying in bed, half dozing under the influence of painkillers, when suddenly an image flashed in my head. Not a memory, but an image, bright and detailed, like a frame from a movie. I was standing in a nursery I'd never seen before with walls painted soft yellow, pictures of animals hanging on them, and by the window stood a white crib with a mobile of colorful butterflies, while sunlight streamed through curtains with tiny flowers, creating warm patches on the wooden floor. But the strangest thing was that I felt emotions connected to this room. Joy, anticipation, love, as if I had prepared this room for someone very important. The problem was that Tom and I never had children, having tried for several years but eventually deciding we were happy, just the two of us, and I had never prepared a nursery. I tried to dismiss this vision and blamed it on the medication or brain trauma, but the image wouldn't disappear, and every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that yellow room where I could smell fresh paint and hear the soft tinkling of the mobile in the breeze. I told Tom about the strange visions, and he became concerned, thinking it was a side effect of the trauma, and promising to talk to Dr. Stone. But the next day the visions became even more vivid and detailed. I saw myself sitting at a kitchen table in a house that definitely wasn't ours, decorated in country style with wooden cabinets, checkered curtains, and an old-fashioned stove with cast iron burners. And on the table stood a cup of coffee, whose bitter flavor I could taste on my tongue. Across from me sat a man I'd never seen but somehow knew. Dark hair, brown eyes, a scar on his chin from a childhood injury. And he was smiling at me while I felt warmth in my chest and love that was deep and real. He called me M, and I understood that M was me, but no one had ever called me that. I woke from this vision with a pounding heart, while the nurse checking my vitals looked concerned about my elevated pulse, and I told her it was just a strange dream. But it wasn't a dream, because it was too real and too detailed. I remembered the texture of the wooden table under my fingers, the smell of cinnamon wafting from baking in the oven, and the sound of a ticking clock on the wall. Dr. Stone came after talking with Tom and explained that my visions could be related to the trauma, since the brain sometimes creates false memories trying to fill in gaps. But I objected because I felt smells, tastes, and emotions, which didn't seem like hallucinations. The MRI showed nothing unusual. My brain looked normal except for minor swelling that should resolve on its own, but the visions didn't stop, and instead became more frequent and intense. I saw my first day of high school in a building I'd never seen, remembered being nervous and standing in front of a mirror in a bathroom with blue tiles while adjusting a new blouse, smelling cheap perfume, and hearing the sound of the school bell. I saw myself working in a small bookstore that smelled of old paper and coffee, arranging books on shelves, talking with regular customers, and dreaming of someday writing my own book. But I had never worked in a bookstore, because after college, I went straight to an advertising agency and had worked as a designer my entire career. The most disturbing thing was that these memories were beginning to seem more real than my own life. And when I tried to remember my actual first day of high school, the images were blurry and unclear, while that other first day with the blue bathroom and new blouse was crystal clear. Tom was scared by my condition because I was talking about places I'd never been and people I'd never met, and he suggested seeing a psychiatrist. That night, I had the most vivid episode of all. I was standing on the threshold of the same house with the yellow nursery in the evening, with warm light glowing in the windows, holding keys in my hands but trembling, not from cold, but from fear. Someone was following me, and I couldn't see his face, but I felt his presence and the malice radiating from him in waves, knowing I needed to get into the house, lock the door, and hide. But the key wouldn't turn in the lock, because my hands shook so badly I couldn't hit the keyhole, and the footsteps behind me were getting closer. A voice called out. A male voice, familiar, but with threat in it, saying my name, Emily, and telling me not to run. I turned and saw a silhouette in the darkness, a tall man with broad shoulders, whose face was hidden in shadow, but I knew he wanted to hurt me. I whispered a plea to be left alone. He stepped forward and moonlight illuminated his face, which I didn't recognize, but at the same time I knew he was part of my life, part of Emily's life, because that's what he called me. Emily. I woke with a scream that woke the entire ward, and nurses came running thinking I was having a seizure, while Tom, who had been sleeping in the chair next to my bed, looked terrified. He said that I screamed the name Emily. I didn't remember screaming that, but the name Emily echoed in my head like an echo in an empty room. Dr. Stone came early in the morning with a serious face and suggested transferring me to a specialized clinic in Portland, because what was happening to me was beyond his expertise. But I refused because I asked for a little more time, thinking maybe this would pass on its own. But I knew it wouldn't pass because these memories, these visions, were part of something bigger, part of the life of a girl named Emily who had somehow penetrated my mind. And I was going to find out who she was and what was happening to me, even if it drove me insane. I was discharged from the hospital after a week, but we didn't go home because instead I convinced Tom to stay at a motel in Cedar Ridge for a few more days, telling him I wanted to recover from the trauma in a peaceful environment. But the truth was that I was drawn to this town like a magnet. Emily's memories were becoming more insistent, and every night I saw new scenes from her life that all took place here in Cedar Ridge. So I knew that if I wanted to understand what was happening to me, I needed to explore this town. Cedar Ridge was a typical small Oregon town with a population of about 3,000, a main street with antique shops and cafes, surrounded by forests and mountains where autumn maples created a bright carpet of yellow and red leaves on the sidewalks. Tom worried whether I felt well enough for walks, but I assured him that I needed fresh air because the doctor said that light physical activity would help recovery. We left the motel and headed toward downtown, but as soon as we turned onto Main Street, I was overcome by a strange feeling because I knew this town. Not from Emily's memories, I just knew it. I pointed right and said that around the corner there should be a library, and Tom looked at me in surprise, wondering how I knew that. I didn't know how, but when we turned the corner, there really stood an old brick building with a sign reading Cedar Ridge Public Library. Inside worked an elderly woman with gray hair gathered in a neat bun who looked up from a book she was cataloging and smiled at us. I asked if they had a local newspaper archive, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Parker and led us upstairs where the archive was organized by year with old newspaper bundles neatly arranged in boxes. Intuitively, I felt I needed to look for something recent, so I asked to see the last 5 or 6 years, and Mrs. Parker brought several boxes while Tom and I began looking through newspapers. Most consisted of ordinary small-town news like school events, local politics, and sale announcements. But in an issue from 5 years ago in November, I found what I was looking for. The headline read, "Local Girl Missing," with a photo underneath of a young woman with long chestnut hair and green eyes smiling at the camera, and something about that smile seemed familiar. The article said that Emily Hartwell, age 23, had disappeared Sunday evening. Her car was found in the parking lot at Pine Lake, but there was no trace of Emily herself, and police asked anyone with information to contact the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department. Emily, that was the name from my visions. We continued searching and found several more articles about Emily Hartwell, showing that the search continued for several months, but no traces were found, and gradually news about her disappeared from the newspaper pages. I asked Mrs. Parker if she remembered this girl, and the elderly woman's face darkened. She said it was a terrible story because Emily was such a sweet girl who worked at Johnson's bookstore, and everyone in town loved her. Bookstore, I remembered the bookstore from my visions. Mrs. Parker continued, saying no one knows what happened to Emily because she just disappeared. Police thought she might have committed suicide since she had problems with her boyfriend, but they never found a body, and her mother still hoped she was alive. I learned that Emily's mother, Margaret, still lived in the same house, and the poor woman never got over losing her daughter. When we left the library, Tom immediately turned to me and demanded explanations. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk because it was time to tell Tom the truth. I explained that my visions were Emily Hartwell's memories, and I saw scenes from her life, her house, her work, her relationships, as if her memories had somehow gotten into my head. Tom didn't believe such a thing was possible, because memories don't transfer from person to person. But how else could I explain that I knew about the library, or that I found an article about exactly the girl whose name I screamed in my sleep? I decided to find Emily's mother because I needed to learn more about Emily. Tom thought this was a bad idea because I would traumatize a woman who lost her daughter. But I had already decided that if I wanted to understand what was happening to me, I needed answers, and the only person who could give them was Margaret Hartwell. We found her address in the motel's phone book, and the house was on Elm Street, in a quiet residential area with small houses surrounded by gardens. When we approached house number 247, my heart began beating faster because this was the same house from my visions. A white one-story house with blue shutters, a small porch with a swing, and a flower bed with withered autumn flowers. I knew this house, and knew that if you went inside and up the stairs, on the right would be a yellow room that was supposed to become a nursery. I went up to the porch and knocked on the door, and after a few seconds it was opened by a woman about 50, with tired eyes and graying hair, and in her features I recognized Emily, the same green eyes and the same lip shape. I introduced myself and said I wanted to talk to her about Emily. The woman's face changed as hope and pain mixed in her eyes, and she asked if I knew something about her daughter. Margaret Hartwell invited us into the house, and again I experienced that same feeling of recognition because the living room was exactly as I remembered it. Beige sofa, fireplace with family photos on the mantel, and large window overlooking the backyard. I took a deep breath and began my story, explaining that after the accident I began remembering a life that wasn't mine. Margaret listened silently while her face became increasingly tense. Finally, she asked if I had seen a yellow room. When I confirmed that I had seen a nursery with a butterfly mobile, Margaret stood and headed for the stairs, asking me to show her this room. We went up to the second floor and I turned right without hesitation, knowing the door at the end of the corridor was closed, but understanding what was behind it. Margaret opened the door, and I saw exactly the same room from my visions. Yellow walls, white crib, butterfly mobile, and everything was covered with a thin layer of dust as if the room hadn't been used for years. Margaret spoke quietly, saying Emily was preparing this room because she was pregnant when she disappeared, and no one knew about it except Margaret because Emily hadn't told the baby's father yet. I felt the room begin to spin around me because Emily was pregnant, and I felt her joy and her love for the future child. I asked who the father was. Margaret answered that it was David Crawford, saying they dated for 2 years, but the relationship was complicated, and Emily was afraid to tell him. David, the man from my visions, the one who sat with her at the kitchen table. I told Mrs. Hartwell that I knew this sounded crazy, but I thought Emily was trying to tell me something through these memories. Margaret turned to me with desperate hope in her eyes and asked what Emily was trying to say. I didn't know, but I was going to find out. Tom took my hand and insisted that we should go home because I wasn't in a condition to investigate. But I knew I couldn't leave. Not now, when I was beginning to understand what was happening. Because Emily Hartwell disappeared 5 years ago, pregnant and frightened, and now her memories somehow lived in my head. I needed to find out what happened to her and why she chose me to tell her story. That night at the motel, Emily's memories crashed over me with new force, and now that I knew her name and story, the visions became more coherent, as if someone had assembled scattered puzzle pieces into a single picture. But they also became darker and more invasive. I saw Emily at work at Johnson's bookstore on Main Street, a small, cozy space with high shelves and the smell of old paper and fresh coffee, where Emily loved this job because she could read in her free time and recommend books to regular customers. But there was something disturbing in these memories because Emily often looked over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone, and when the bell above the door rang, she would jump because she was frightened. In the morning, Tom said that I was talking in my sleep again, addressing someone named David and begging him to leave me alone. David Crawford, the father of Emily's child. But the memories showed me something else, something that made my blood run cold. I saw Emily late one evening closing the bookstore and locking the back door when she heard voices in the alley and looked out the window. 2 men stood there next to a dark blue pickup, and one was handing the other a package that was obviously something illegal. When one of the men turned toward the light, Emily saw his face. She recognized him as Frank Miller, the owner of the hardware store down the street and a respected member of the community. Emily ducked away from the window, but it was too late because Frank had seen her. The next memory showed Emily at home, pacing in the yellow nursery, and deciding what to do because she had seen Frank Miller dealing drugs. And if she told the police, she'd be doing the right thing. But she was also pregnant, alone, and frightened. She decided to leave town and start over somewhere else, somewhere safe. But Frank Miller had other plans. The final memory hit me like a physical blow. Emily was at Pine Lake, sitting in her car, crying and calling her mother, begging for help because she couldn't come home since someone was pursuing her and threatening to find her anywhere. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights approaching, the dark blue Ford pickup. Emily got out of the car and started running toward the forest, but Frank was faster and stronger. He caught her among the trees, and she begged for mercy and told him about her unborn child. Frank was surprised by the news of the pregnancy, and his voice became cold and angry as he accused her of lying and trying to manipulate him. Emily desperately tried to convince him that she was telling the truth and was going to tell David, but just didn't have time. The blow hit her in the stomach, and Emily screamed in pain, falling to the ground and curling up while trying to protect the baby. Her last words were a plea for life, not only her own, but also the child's. But Frank was already lifting a stone. The memory cut off, and I found myself screaming in the motel room while Tom was holding my shoulders, his face distorted with fear as he tried to wake me and bring me back to reality. Through tears, I whispered the terrible truth that Emily was murdered along with her unborn child. Tom didn't understand who I was talking about or why I was so frightened. But I knew because I had seen Emily's death and knew who killed her. Frank Miller was still here in Cedar Ridge, living his life while Emily rotted in an unmarked grave somewhere in those woods. I looked at Tom and told him we needed to go to the police. He objected and reminded me that I couldn't know this because I'd never met Emily But I saw her death and saw who killed her. And I wasn't going to stop until I got justice for her and her unborn child. Sheriff James Riley listened to my story with professional skepticism, understanding that I had suffered trauma, but finding the idea of transferring memories from the dead to the living absurd. I asked how else to explain that I knew details that were never made public, like Emily's pregnancy, her call to her mother on the last night, and her being killed in the forest by Pine Lake. The sheriff admitted that the information about Emily's pregnancy really wasn't made public, but he suggested that her mother could have told me. I offered to check this with Margaret Hartwell, who would confirm that I knew about the yellow room before she showed it to me. The sheriff sighed and decided to listen to what exactly I could tell. I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct Emily's memories of that last night. I described how Emily came to the lake to think about her situation because she was frightened and didn't know what to do about the pregnancy, and she called her mother, but then saw a car that had been following her. The sheriff asked about the car. I strained my memory and said it was dark and large, a pickup, a dark blue Ford with a sticker on the bumper about fishing. The sheriff's face changed and he asked if I was sure about the sticker. I nodded because I could see it clearly in Emily's memory. The sheriff opened a drawer in his desk, pulled out a file, and showed me a photograph. It was Frank Miller standing next to a dark blue Ford pickup with a fishing sticker on the bumper. The sheriff spoke quietly, saying Frank Miller had been questioned 5 years ago, claiming he was home that night with his wife providing an alibi, and there was no evidence to contradict him. But the sheriff had always suspected Frank because the man had a history of violence, a sealed juvenile record, and rumors of drug dealing that were never proven. I continued the story and described how Emily tried to run into the forest but was caught, how Frank hit her with a stone, and how he buried her body. The sheriff asked if I knew where. I closed my eyes and tried to see through Emily's fading consciousness. Trees, a large boulder shaped like a bear, and a stream nearby. The sheriff stood and said he knew that place, Bear Rock, about 2 miles into the forest from Pine Lake. He made a call, and within an hour a search team was heading to Bear Rock. They found Emily's remains that same day, buried in a shallow grave exactly where I said she would be. The forensic evidence was clear. Blunt force trauma to the head, and defensive wounds on her hands showed she had fought for her life. Frank Miller was arrested that evening, and during interrogation he broke down and confessed everything. Emily had seen him dealing drugs and threatened to go to the police, so he couldn't let that happen, and followed her to the lake, killed her, and buried her in the woods. He thought he'd gotten away with it, but Emily found a way to tell her story through me. The trial lasted 3 months, and Frank Miller was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Emily's body was finally laid to rest in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, and her mother could finally grieve properly. Justice had been served. But for me, nothing was over. Because Emily's memories didn't disappear after the trial, but grew stronger and more invasive. I started forgetting my own life, couldn't remember how I met Tom, forgot my best friend's name from college, and my own memories were becoming blurred and unclear while Emily's memories remained crystal clear. One evening, Tom found me in the kitchen at 3 a.m. making coffee with cinnamon, a drink I'd never liked. He asked who I was making it for. I looked at him, and for a moment I didn't recognize him because I expected to see David, Emily's David. Tom's face went pale and he said I'd called him David 3 times that week. I was losing myself because Emily wasn't just sharing her memories. She was taking over, consuming me, and erasing Lisa Collins while replacing her with Emily Hartwell. I went to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist who specialized in dissociative disorders and had her office in Portland. Dr. Mitchell listened to my story and acknowledged the unusualness of my case. She offered several theories, suggesting perhaps my brain trauma had made me susceptible to some form of psychic phenomenon, or perhaps I was experiencing a severe dissociative episode triggered by the accident. I asked what would happen to me and whether I'd ever be Lisa again. Dr. Mitchell chose her words carefully and said that in cases of severe dissociation, sometimes the original personality can be overwritten and replaced by the alternate identity. I asked if that was happening to me. She didn't answer directly, but just said we should start intensive therapy immediately. But I knew therapy wouldn't help because this wasn't a mental illness. Emily was real, her memories were real, and she was taking over my mind, my body, and my life. Tom noticed the changes because I walked differently, talked differently, and had different preferences and different habits. One night he asked me directly because he wanted to know if Lisa was still in there. I looked at him and wanted to say yes, wanted to reassure him, but I wasn't sure anymore. The woman looking back at him from my eyes, was she Lisa or Emily or something in between? I didn't know. And that terrified me more than anything. Because if Emily could take over my mind and erase Lisa Collins while replacing her with Emily Hartwell, then death wasn't the end. It was just a transfer, a parasite jumping from host to host, consuming lives and erasing identities. I thought about the dreams I'd been having about a young girl named Sophie in Canada, who was 5 years old and drawing pictures of a woman she'd never met. A woman who looked exactly like me. I understood now that when my time came and Emily had fully consumed Lisa, the cycle would continue. Part of this consciousness would jump to Sophie, and Sophie would start having memories that weren't hers, and visions of lives she'd never lived. And slowly, inevitably, Sophie would disappear and be replaced by whoever came before. An endless chain of stolen lives, erased identities, and consumed souls. I was no longer a person, but a vessel, a temporary host for something that had been jumping from body to body for God knows how long. Emily wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't helping Emily get justice. I was being devoured by her, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Last week, Tom left me because he said he couldn't watch Lisa disappear anymore and couldn't live with a stranger wearing his wife's face. I didn't blame him because I barely recognized myself in the mirror. The woman staring back had Emily's mannerisms, Emily's smile, and Emily's way of tilting her head when thinking. Lisa Collins was dying, and Emily Hartwell was being reborn. I'm writing this as a warning to whoever comes next, and to Sophie when she's old enough to understand. This isn't a gift, it's not reincarnation, and it's not spiritual awakening. It's a parasite, a consciousness that feeds on others, that erases them and replaces them. And once it finds you, there's no escape. I can feel Lisa slipping away with her memories fading like old photographs left in the sun, and soon there will be nothing left of her. Only Emily and all the others who came before, an endless chain of stolen lives. And when my time comes and this body dies, the parasite will jump again, to Sophie or someone like her, and the cycle will continue forever. I'm sorry, Lisa. I tried to fight and tried to hold on, but Emily is stronger. She's always been stronger, and soon there will be only her.